Hey everybody, my name is TurtleZoom and welcome back to Amnesia, a machine for pigs. In the last episode, we finished our journey, defeated the machine by sacrificing her life in a last shot for redemption. But I wanted to make this epilogue video because this game has such an interesting story, told in such an effective way. Much of the story is left up to the actual player to piece together like a puzzle, but of course, because of my stupid person brain, there was a lot that I either missed or was just straight up wrong about. After doing some research on this game's story, I was blown away, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So today, we're gonna explain the whole story of Amnesia, a machine for pigs. Now, obviously, this is going to contain major spoilers for both this game and its predecessor, Amnesia, The Dark Descent. And again, if you're watching a story explained video, chances are you already knew that. But without further ado, let's dive on in. The main character of Machine for Pigs is named Oswald Mandus. He was born in London sometime in the 1850s. His parents owned a meatpacking factory, which he inherited after they passed away. As an adult, he met and fell in love with a woman named Lilibeth. After some time, the two of them were happily married, and they lived together in Mandus's mansion. Over the course of his life with Lily, he founded charities, gave jobs to those who needed them, supported his local orphanage, worked to reform child labor laws, and was overall a very kind and compassionate man. He was not without his flaws, of course. He used some of his wealth, for instance, to build secret passageways in his mansion, which included two-way mirrors that allowed him to spy on any guests or even his own wife while she was in the bathtub.
Someone's just able to spy on you in the bathtub!
Whether or not Lily was aware and or okay with this? Jury's still out on that one. Perhaps his only flaw was that he was a closet pervert, I guess. However, his entire life was changed on one single day. The day his twin sons, Edwin and Enoch, were born. You see, what should have been a happy day for him and his wife turned grim, as Lily died from complications delivering their sons. While both of the children survived, it was a bittersweet feeling for Oswald, to say the least. On that very day, he swore to Lily that he would protect and care for their children with everything he had, until the day of his death. Little did he know that those very words would one day be used against him. Oswald did as he promised, and devoted nearly all his spare time to his children. However, he loved them to a fault, to which even he admitted in one of his journal entries. Quote, "And they were inseparable, always together, one soul in two bodies, and my love was all-consuming. I would die for you," I whispered to their sleeping faces. "I would kill. I would set this world to ruin to protect you." End quote. Years later, he decided to start investing in automation for his factory, with the goal of making work far less dangerous and tedious for his employees, as well as saving himself and his company some money. However, this ended up backfiring when he invested too much into his machinery, with too little progress. He started losing money slowly but surely, and eventually, it reached the point where he was likely to have his house repossessed. He didn't have any answers, and became desperate. Now, we're gonna have to turn back the clocks a bit. Remember Alexander, the main antagonist from The Dark Descent? Yeah, he was Oswald's great uncle. During my playthrough, I got the impression that this was the case from this note, which describes Mandus receiving a crate, which contains what most fans agree to be the body of a servant grunt from the first game. Quote, "It is humanoid in shape, but has suffered severe skeletal deformity. Leather straps encase the torso, which is deformed, with evidence of substantial muscle mass and displacement. What he is, I cannot tell. but I smell the orb upon him, and suspect my great-uncle's presence in his curious condition." End quote. The reason I say his great-uncle was Alexander and not Daniel, like other fans have theorized, is because Daniel had nothing to do with the Gatherers, as they were called, or their creation. They hunted him and tried to kill him, yes, but it was Alexander that actually created and commanded them, not the orb like I had previously thought. Oswald looked to his great-uncle for answers, as he had nowhere else to turn. So he read through a bunch of paperwork left by Alexander regarding a bunch of different things from the first game, including the substance known as vitae, the creatures known as the Gatherers, and most importantly, the orbs. The orbs are, in simple terms, really fucking complicated. Not much is definitively known about the orbs, like how they work, where they come from, or even how many of them there are. What we do know is that they're magical in nature and seem to be able to do pretty much anything, from opening portals to other worlds, breaking down barriers, to creating giant fucking invisible shadow monsters that leave fleshy trails behind them as they come and try to fuck you for touching it. It's reasonable to assume that Mandus didn't have any idea how these orbs worked either, as all he could see when he read what Alexander wrote about them was that they sounded like the perfect solution to his problem. From the sound of things, his intention was never to actually use the orb, but rather to sell it and fix his financial problems for good. Quote, "I have told the children, truly this will be an extraordinary adventure. If those old stones hold the financial benefits I predict, it will be merely the first of many." End quote. So he set out on a journey to find one of these orbs, and he even let Edwin and Enoch tag along with him on his adventure. Eventually, he actually managed to track one down to an Aztec temple somewhere in Mexico. Edwin and Enoch were actually the first ones to find it, saying,
"Come and see, Papa. We found an egg. A stone egg."
A stone egg? Oh no. No, 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 no. You found an orb, didn't you?
This particular orb is an entirely new one, never mentioned nor seen in the first game. It's never directly shown in this game either, and as such, it has completely new abilities. The moment Oswald touched this orb, it was too late for him. The orb began filling his head with visions of the future, specifically the next 100 years, the 20th century. In these visions, he saw both world wars, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cold War, and many more gruesome events. What he saw that shocked him the most, however, were the deaths of his two sons. The orb showed him that they would both die excruciating deaths at the Battle of Somme during the First World War. Understandably traumatized, these visions drove Oswald quite insane. In a desperate state, he wanted nothing more than to spare his children the fate he had been shown in store for them. He had to change their future at all costs. So, what Oswald did was he dragged his children to an altar within the temple and sacrificed them both in an old Aztec ritual by carving out their still beating hearts. In that moment, the visions from the orb actually split Oswald's very soul in two. Quote, "At that point did my soul split, creating him? Was this the egg of my soul, the moment the great clock began to tick?" End quote. After reading this, I jokingly said,
So what, the AI is our split personality? Our evil half?
As it turns out, I was actually right. Well, sort of. But more on that later. With the orb in his possession, and after taking the skulls of his children with him, either as a sign of guilt or something else, it's not really known, Mandus returned to London, where he buried the skulls of his boys under the rhododendrons in of his garden. The split in his soul was accompanied by a split in his mind as well, in the form of a second personality. This new personality, who would eventually become known simply as the Engineer, had taken root in Mandus's body, showing Mandus visions of himself and speaking to him, transforming Mandus into a new version of himself. This new Mandus hated the world and its people. He became disgusted with humanity and would often compare them to being little more than filthy pigs. His new goal was to, quote, save the world from its doomed future by implementing the sacrificial rituals of the ancient Aztecs. Quote, no, my darlings, they most certainly were not savages. You see, they believed that the sky could fall on their heads, and they truly believed that offering blood was the only way of stopping this from happening. Perhaps they were mistaken altogether, or perhaps their tragedy was they could simply not spill blood enough to prevent the sky from falling upon them. End quote. His plan was to mechanize the process of human sacrifice to an industrial scale. Thus, he began working on what we know as the machine. He started building the machine under his meat processing factory and expanded it to even reach under his own house. At its core was a great pyramid that closely resembled the very same Aztec temple from which he discovered the orb. Speaking of the orb, he did not end up selling it as he had initially intended, but rather, he integrated it into his machine as a power source. Likely the engineer told him to do so. The construction of the machine was carried out by children that he would kidnap from the very orphanage he used to help fund. Many of these children would die from hot steam when working simple maintenance. Oswald knew, however, that he needed more than just children working on the machine if he wanted to make enough progress, which is when his experiments began. Remember that servant grunt body that he received in the mail? Well, this is actually what sparked an idea for him. Quote again, so it can be done. We can reshape the body into a tool. Accelerate the process of Mr. Darwin's evolution. But here, my great uncle and I part company. He chose men as the subjects of his experiments. But men are difficult to control and rotten with sentimentality. No, we require a new creature for our chattels. Loyal, clever, strong, easily sated. End quote. He used the grunt's body and conducted experiments on the substance he extracted from it, known as vitae. Vitae is a fictional substance from The Dark Descent. In that game, Alexander tricked the main protagonist Daniel into creating this substance for him by committing acts of intense torture on his castle's many prisoners. His plan was to gather enough of this stuff and use the orb he stole from Daniel to open a portal to his home world. Yeah, Alexander is from another dimension. That's a fucking thing I learned when doing my research. After finding the vitae, Mandus was able to quickly figure out the method of its creation, and set out to make more. He started abducting the poor and the criminals of London, and tortured them, just like his great-uncle before him, to create the vitae. With it, he was able to create Compound X, a chemical we find in-game which is highly sensitive to light, highly flammable, and highly corrosive. Oh, did I mention it can also revive the freaking dead? Quote, took the dog and injected it with strychnine.
Strychnine? Strychnine! Ah!
After the expected convulsions and spasming, it died just after midnight. I immersed the body in a large tank of Compound X, and introduced an alternating current via induction coil for a period of 3.5 minutes. Partial return was induced. End quote. Not only could Compound X revive the dead, it also allowed Mandus to create the game's signature enemies, the man-pigs. Man-pigs are essentially creatures made by stitching together body parts from a human and a pig. Now, in real life, this would be completely impossible. For one thing, the person and the pig would both be dead from being separated into pieces, and even if you could somehow separate someone's body parts while keeping them alive, stitching them together with that of a pig's wouldn't work. Humans and pigs have very different DNA, and therefore their cells would not bond with each other. It is possible to reattach a person's severed limb, such as a finger, assuming it's done quickly enough, but that only works because it is that person's human finger, with identical DNA to the cells in their hand. Compound X is what allows Mandus to bypass both of these problems. Quote, in order to facilitate assimilation of tissue groups, a compound is required or the cells will not bond. Disposal of non-bonded subjects must be immediate and using incineration, or we risk continuous animation without form. This is unpleasant. End quote. When I played through the game, I assumed that the machine's purpose was the creation of these man-pigs. I was only half right. The machine was initially built just to cause mass slaughter, but was modified later on to use the body parts harvested from the sacrifices to create more man-pigs. This is why there are enough of them to be considered an army by the end of the game, and why they all look so similar. The process of making them was all automated and followed the same template when performed by the machine. Not all of the man-pigs were considered a success, especially the early versions of them created by hand. Quote, several of the older forms have breached their containment area and escaped into the sewers. Up here, where the air is hot and fetid, they become overheated, and their duality tears them asunder. As the other place flies from their cells and their vitae splinters, they live sporadically, torn from one world to the other and back again in violent, unpredictable bursts. For a few seconds they are creatures of this world, then they are torn away and cease to have physical form. End quote. Have you guessed what he's describing there? Jumping from one world to another? The first thing that comes to my mind are the Tesla, the electric, teleporting man-pigs only found late in the game. What I thought was them simply teleporting was actually them being forced back and forth between our dimension and another. This actually makes a whole lot of sense when you think about it. If you remember, Alexander wanted to use the vitae to travel between dimensions, and now that dimension hopping property is shown once again in the Tesla. This note actually refers to one more thing, believe it or not. It also refers to the creatures simply known as the failed experiments. Like the note said, the powers of the Tesla grow out of control when they become overheated, such as the ones that escaped into the sewer. What is it that we find in the sewers, by the way? That's right. It's the water monsters. These are not the same creatures from the first game at all. The Teslas that we do find are all in areas that are kept cool. That's the only reason they can exist there. The ones in the sewer got too hot, and as a result, they became invisible, constantly jumping back and forth between dimensions at an extremely fast rate. The part that I don't entirely understand is why they're limited to only existing in the water. My best theory is that the sewage water keeps them slightly cooler than they would be otherwise. While it's not enough to keep them stable, it's likely that their condition would be much worse if they did leave the water. Anyways, these are the man-pigs, and they soon became the new workforce that constructed and worked maintenance for the machine. It's never made clear exactly why they obeyed Mandus, but we know that they only obeyed the cruel and insane version of him. More on that later. With the man-pigs at his disposal, the machine grew quickly, soon becoming big enough to cover nearly all of London. By this point, Mandus had captured and killed so many people, his murder spree spawned the legend of Jack the Ripper. Because of this, members of his rifle club and detectives from the ministry grew suspicious of him and sent a representative to investigate him. This man was simply known as Professor A. the professor can be heard having several conversations with Mandus that can be heard in recordings found throughout the game. They have several conversations as Mandus shows the professor around his home, one of which has Mandus telling the professor that he contracted some kind of sickness from his trip to Mexico.
I must say, my dear man, you look awful.
Yes, I seem to have picked up something rather nasty recently.
Now, it's made clear that this sickness is actually something he has displayed for almost a full year at this point. That's not some normal disease. I believe this disease is not a disease at all, but rather a side effect of the orb's magic. Have you ever had your soul split in half? You'd probably feel like shit too. The recordings actually reveal a lot to us. For instance,
Your faith shackles your vision, Professor. It is an iron coffin that keeps you from grasping the future. We require a new deity, one of steam and the wheel, of magnetism and progress. The old god is nothing more than a lamed hog, spitting back offal at mankind.
this shows us that he viewed the machine he was building as a replacement for God himself. He clearly blamed God for the deaths of his wife and children, and his quest to save the future was also a quest to take revenge against what he felt was a corrupt and evil deity. The most important message that we hear, in my opinion, is this one.
But we can save them. We can set them free. We can replace a rotten old world with a clean new one. Mr. Mandus, you sound every bit the fanatic.
Well, how can I be otherwise, Professor? How can any man of ethics simply stand by and watch this world drown in its own excrement?
And your engineer, this visionary with whom we embarked upon this course, does he share your views?
Indeed he does. Indeed he does. The poor fellow has seen it all before. Now, this is not the first great civilization he has wept for.
This recording actually gives us our first look into the engineer. Mandus in this recording is referring to the engineer as though he were a separate person, which is evidence to suggest that perhaps the engineer is actually the personification of the orb itself, which combined itself with the second half of Mandus' soul, and not a split personality of Mandus' like I had previously thought. This is not the first great civilization he has wept for. Could be referring to the Aztecs, which the orb was present for as their civilization fell to ruin. Certainly not something Mandus was present for. This also would explain why the man-pigs would obey Mandus. In truth, they were never being controlled by Mandus. They were being controlled by the engineer who was controlling Mandus. They obeyed the engineer because he was made by the orb, which has connections to the vitae that holds them together. Their final conversation has Mandus leading the professor into the deepest parts of the machine, before he sacrifices him to the machine as well, likely turning the professor into another man-pig.
I can meet him, your great engineer. How marvelous. I must say, Mr. Mandus, my excitement is almost unseemly.
Yes, I can see that. Step this way, Professor. I will be right behind you.
The professor sounds exactly like the orb.
Mandus, what the devil are you? I can't see a damn thing. Mandus! We are the pig, Professor. We are all the pig.
Over time, Mandus began developing the machine further and further, as well as more efficient ways to capture live humans, as the machine became closer to being fully automated. This continued for some time until one day, for reasons still unknown, the engineer within Mandus' head left, along with his half of Mandus' soul, and was placed into the orb. The engineer had returned home. Once this happened, the engineer's new body became the machine itself. The machine was alive. The man-pigs were at his disposal, and Mandus' sickness became much worse. It's one thing to have your soul split in half, it's entirely another to have one of those halves ripped from your body. Once the engineer left his mind, Mandus had a change of heart. He returned to his former self, and decided to put a stop to the machine and its slaughter. From the machine's core, he made his way out and to his home, sabotaging anything he could find. Quote, "Can a man construct himself anew? Can a man, on realizing who he is, on what he has become, tear himself apart down to the bricks and begin again? Can a man defined by his actions, defined by that which he now finds abhorrent, set to sabotaging this body, his machine, until those children of his soul turn in a new motion, and he may awake to a new sun, a new year, a new century with hope in his heart?" As I reach my hands to the exposed wires, I ask myself this: is redemption possible for such a creature as I? And if not, then surely better to die amongst my creations than to continue to live as a monster. End quote. His sickness got so bad after losing his soul's other half. He felt he was going to die. This is why the damage he did to the machine was rushed and minimal. He simply felt he didn't have much time left. After doing what he could, he made his way back to his home. As the note describes, he then reached for some exposed wiring in an attempt to commit suicide. This ultimately failed. He stumbled his way to his bedroom and let himself lie down and shut his eyes for what he felt would be the final time. He was wrong. He later woke back up on the night of New Year's Eve, 1899, with complete amnesia. Whether the amnesia was a result of him electrocuting himself, his soul being ripped from his body, or a combination of both, well, that's up for debate. Finally, this is where the events of the game begin. Mandus wakes up with no memory of who he is or where he is. All he knows is that he can hear the voices of his children calling him to come and find them. It's unknown exactly as to how he's able to hear and see his children despite them being long dead, but we know that the machine has something to do with it. The machine uses the illusions of his children to lure Mandus back down to the machine and repair the damage he has done previously before he lost his memory. After some wandering, Mandus comes to his office, where he receives a phone call from the engineer, the other half of his soul. The voice over the phone says not but 6 words.
Hello?
Precious eagle cactus fruit. Help us.
Before immediately hanging up. At first, I thought this was some kind of code, but upon researching, I learned that the precious eagle cactus fruit is actually the name given to the heart torn from the sacrificial victim in the old Aztec rituals. It wasn't a code at all, but rather a nod to the machine's true intentions. In the next phone call he receives, after some more exploring, the engineer tells Mandus that his children are trapped far underground in the deepest bowels of the machine, and are at risk because of floodwaters rising and potentially drowning them. This is, of course, a lie, but Mandus doesn't hesitate to believe him, and sets out underground to find his sons. The engineer tells Mandus that the only way to save his children is to repair the damages done to the machine, to which Mandus agrees. He makes his way beneath the church, his own meatpacking factory, and his own home, to find the vast expanse of the machine, learning more and more about his past from various notes, diaries, and phonograms found throughout the game. He makes repairs along the way to progress further and further underground until he encounters the man-pigs, who immediately try to kill him. In theory, if the engineer were controlling the man-pigs, then you'd think he wouldn't want them to try and kill Mandus. After all, he needs him to complete the repairs in order to finish his desire to cleanse the world through human sacrifice. My best explanation for why the man-pigs attack is that I believe they simply aren't being controlled at this time because the machine can't while it is damaged. I'm sure the man-pigs are naturally violent, but perhaps they even recognize Mandus as the man that turned them into monsters, and simply want revenge. The only thing Mandus can do is avoid them and hide from them as he makes his way further down, repairing the damage along the way. Eventually, Mandus finishes the repairs at this chamber here. Upon finishing the last repairs and throwing a lever, the machine is fully operational again, and the engineer reveals his deception to Mandus.
I live. I breathe again. I rise. I will rise to bleach the sky and still the water. I will spin the world wheel and set the future upon the path to redemption.
Where are my children? You promised me my children!
My time is come. More pig. More pig.
After surviving the machine's attack, Mandus wakes up and learns the truth. He learns the truth about the deaths of his sons, that they died by his hand. His new goal, his new purpose, is to take revenge against the engineer, and perhaps even redeem his damned soul. He soon finds himself freed from the bowels of the machine and is once again outside. He has escaped from the underground. However, he isn't the only one who has. The man-pigs follow and are released into the streets by the machine, slaughtering all they can find and burning everything else. This was the engineer's goal all along, the destruction of humanity and the reign of the pigs. Mandus watches in horror as the fruits of his labor kill at random and destroy all they can find. He manages to avoid being killed himself, and he decides that his next best course of action is to stop the machine at its core. So, he finds an access point and willingly returns underground. He's a saboteur once more, breaking anything and everything he can find. The machine tries to stop him, of course, sending his man-pegs and even unleashing the Tesla on Mandus. None of them are able to stop Mandus' rampage. Upon nearing the temple at the machine's center, Mandus came to realize how he could stop the machine. Quote, "Is the only path to redemption to join us together again, to make myself whole, to close the great circle and take that madman into my heart once more, and forgive him, and myself as well." End quote. In the temple, Mandus actually finds what appears to be a body inside some kind of cradle. We can never really get a good look at it, but it's been theorized that the engineer was actually creating himself a humanoid body, like some kind of Age of Ultron shit, so as he could walk amongst his creations as he destroyed the world. He does not get the chance. Mandus quickly finds the sacrificial altar at the top of the stairs, likely the same location as the altar where he sacrificed his children in the original temple. Symbolism and all that. And it is there he ends it all. The claws surrounding the chair tear into Mandus' chest and take out his heart. It is at this moment that Mandus reclaims the other half of his soul and takes the engineer back into his own mind, where both of them perish. Both Mandus and the machine die at exactly 12 a.m., January 1st, 1900. As they die, the prophesized new century begins, and Mandus finds his redemption. It is unknown as to what became of the man-pigs after their master was destroyed. It is possible without the power of the orb, the vitae holding their bodies together would cease to function, and they would fall apart or just simply die. It's also possible that they may have survived. Perhaps some of them escaped into the wild, or maybe underground? Who knows? Maybe we'll find out what happened to them when Rebirth comes out. As for the orb, well, like I said, we never actually see the orb ourselves, so it's unknown if destruction of the engineer destroyed the orb as well, or if it's still there, buried deep under London amidst the ruins of the machine. Maybe. Just maybe. We'll see that orb again someday. Whew, okay, that was a long script. Stories like these have always fascinated me, and I'm so glad I got to play such an amazing game. I don't think it was as good as the first game, but still, I loved Machine for Pigs a lot. I love its story. I love its connections to the first game. I just think the gameplay itself could have been a little better. That's really my only complaint. I've also never tried to do a video like this before, this whole story explained thing. Like, I've seen plenty of those for movies. And I'm sure there's plenty of story explained videos for Machine for Pigs, so thank you. Thank you for choosing mine. So I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know in the comments down below if you want to see more videos like this one in the future. On one final note, I want to thank everyone for 20 subscribers. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but it means a lot to me. I started this whole YouTube venture with high hopes. Then I had those hopes rather crushed when my YouTube videos were lucky enough to get 5 views. One of my more recent Mario Galaxy episodes exploded into over 50 views in just a few hours, and damn it, that made my whole week. It made me so happy. I'm sorry. I hope we can keep this channel growing, because you know what? I love this. I love what I do, and I love you guys. Thank you all so much for watching. I have been Turtle Zoom. And wait a minute. That's out of order. These blind playthroughs, by the way, are going to become a staple in the future to go alongside my Let's Plays, so don't you worry. Tune in for my next blind playthrough of an oldie. How much of an oldie? I don't know. I didn't fucking carbon date it. Thank you all so much for watching. I have been Turtle Zoom, and I will see you guys next time. Peace!